Most people who spend years in therapy or spirituality eventually hit a wall. You know your patterns, you can name them, you can trace them back to your childhood, and yet nothing changes. That's because understanding a pattern and being free from it are two different things. The gap between those 2 points is exactly where the Archons live. There are 12 of these forces, and they aren't your personality. They are the drain patterns feeding on your loops. Here's how they've been hiding in plain sight. The first is the Archon of the Endless Quest. This one feeds on the belief that the answer is always somewhere else. The next book, the next teacher, the next system. People under this Archon are often deeply intelligent and genuinely curious. They accumulate real insight, but the insight never quite lands because the moment it gets close to something true, the quest redirects. There's always something more to find, and that search itself becomes the thing that prevents arrival. The second is the Archon of Worth. This one feeds on the fear that without proof, without achievement, without something to show for yourself, you do not count. It keeps you working way past exhaustion. It keeps you in conversations where you're arguing for your own value. It turns every relationship into an audition and every success into a temporary reprieve before the next thing needs to be earned. The wound underneath it is simple: the belief that rest is something you haven't qualified for yet. The third Archon is the Archon of Return. This is one of the most powerful ones in the system because it operates through memory and emotion, which means it feels a lot like love. It feeds on unfinished business, a relationship that ended wrong, the wound from a family you grew up in, the version of yourself you had to leave behind to survive something. The Archon of Return tells you that if you just go back far enough, or hold on long enough, or even find the right way to resolve what happened, you'll finally be able to move forward. But forward is exactly what the Archon cannot allow. The fourth is the Archon of Hunger. This one is quieter than people expect. It doesn't always show up as greed, but it can show up as a longing, as the feeling that something is always slightly missing, as the inability to be present with what actually is here, because what is here is never quite enough. It feeds on the gap between what you have and what you believe you need, and is very skilled at keeping the gap open. The fifth is the Archon of the Mirror. This one feeds on the inability to know yourself without an external reaction to confirm you. It is not vanity, although it can look like vanity. It's sometimes deeper than that. It is the condition of only being able to feel real when someone else is reflecting you back. When the reflection is positive, everything is fine. When it changes, everything collapses. The self under this Archon has no stable center of gravity. It shifts entirely based on whoever is in the room. The sixth is the Archon of the Locked Gate. This one disguises itself as responsibility, as being careful, as knowing better than to let your guard down. It feeds on control, on the belief that if you can manage every variable, anticipate every outcome, and keep the environment tight enough, nothing will be able to hurt you. The locked gate keeps danger out, but it also keeps everything else out. And every person living behind it often cannot figure out why they feel so isolated while doing everything right. The seventh is the Archon of Becoming. This is the Archon of perpetual preparation, the self that is always getting ready but never quite arriving. There's always one more thing to learn, one more credential to earn, one more area to shore up before it's finally time. The people this Archon attaches to are often genuinely capable, sometimes more capable than almost anyone around them. But the Archon uses that capacity against them by turning growth into a condition for existing, rather than something that happens naturally alongside a life already being lived. Is the Archon of the Witness. This one is worth distinguishing from the Mirror. The Mirror is about identity through others' reactions. The Witness is about performance. It feeds on the need to be observed, to document, to narrate, to share. It is the force that makes you think about how something will sound while you're still inside the experience, just like me right now. The witness turns your life into content before it had the chance to be yours. And over time, the performing self and the living self become very difficult to tell apart. The ninth is the Archon of disillusion. This one is dark in a way that others are not. It feeds on the exhaustion of being a self, on the longing to merge, to disappear, to stop having edges. It shows up in the pull towards substances, towards sleep, towards fantasy, towards relationships where you lose yourself entirely. It's not always destructive on the surface, but it sometimes looks like deep spirituality or profound empathy, an artistic temperament. But at its core, it is a force that whispers that the self is the problem and that ceasing to be one would be a relief. 10th is the Archon of war. This one feeds on conflict as proof of existence. People under this Archon are not always obviously aggressive. Sometimes they argue because they can't feel anything real without resistance. Sometimes they create friction in relationships, not out of cruelty, but out of the need to feel the edges of themselves. Peace feels like disappearing. The Archon of war keeps you fighting because fighting is the only time that you're certain that you're here. The 11th is the Archon of debt. This one is quietly the most devastating one in the whole system. It feeds on guilt, on the belief that you owe your peace, your comfort, your full presence to someone else before you're allowed to have it for yourself. It keeps people small in exactly the moments when they should be taking up space. It rewrites self-care as selfishness and rest as abandonment, and is very skilled at finding people who are already prone to putting others first and deepening that tendency until it becomes kind of a spiritual poverty. And last, but definitely not least, the 12th is the Archon of silence. This one feeds on the fear that your real voice will cost you something you cannot afford to lose: a relationship, a community, a version of yourself that others have come to depend on. The Archon of silence does not require that you lie. It only requires that you leave out the parts that matter most. Over time, the things left out accumulate, and that self that remains, the one permitted to speak, becomes a curated, diminished version of whoever you actually are. Now, those are the 12, and I want to be honest with you about something. Most people will recognize at least 2 or 3 of these immediately. Some will recognize 5 or 6. A smaller group will have an uncomfortable experience recognizing most of them. Not because they're broken, not because these patterns are not random. They're developed in response to real things that happen. They were adaptations before they became drains. That is the most important thing to understand about Archons. They're not your enemies. They were, at some point, your survival strategies. The Archon of silence kept you safe when speaking was dangerous. The Archon of the locked gate protected you when you had no other protection. And the Archon of return held a wound open because something in you knew it hadn't been properly honored yet. They became problems not because they're evil, but because they outlasted their usefulness. And now they run on their own, drawing energy from patterns that no longer serve any real purpose except to the continuation of themselves. Seeing them clearly is not the end of the work, but it is the beginning of it. In the videos ahead, we're going to go into each one of the Archons individually, what it looks like on a specific day, how it shows up in your relationships, your work, or your inner life, and what withdrawing your energy from it actually looks like in practice. This is exactly what Archon astrology is for. Not just to understand yourself, but to stop being spent. If this made something click for you, don't just watch it once. Pay attention to which Archon felt familiar. Like this video if it opens something in you. Share it with somebody who keeps repeating the same pattern, like your mom, your dog, whoever. Subscribe if you want to follow this system as it unfolds. Because every Archon astrology reading comes back to one question: what is feeding on your pattern, and what light are you ready to reclaim? Thank you. See you next time.